Hi, I'm Dr. Mike Rodebarger with ExecuSpect Leadership Development, and I want to talk with you about horticulture's leadership lessons. That's a very strange title slide that we just looked at, but I ran across a reading this week, and I want to share that with you in just a minute. And they used the illustration of a gardener's trellis, which I think was very important. But before I get into that, let me just say that when it comes to life in general, there's right and there's wrong. Now, in some cases, right and wrong are subjective. It's relative. It's, what might be right for one person isn't right for another, and all that could just be an opinion. But there are some things that are just right and some things that are just wrong. And in a business context, in your leadership context, there are things that are absolutely wrong. And so this piece that I'm going to read to you is the author's attempt to help us to understand how to effectively move someone from ineffectiveness to effectiveness, to non-productivity to productivity, how to take somebody who's flawed and help them become a better version of themselves. And that is essentially lessons in leadership. Now, what makes leadership challenging is the fact that there are people that are doing things wrong and they're getting wrong results. And in many cases, the reality behind that is there are people that are doing things wrong, but they believe that they're doing it right. And that might flow out of an experience or their own personality, their comfort level of how they believe they should approach a task, and they think that they're doing it right. They have good intentions. Their motives are pure, but yet they're still achieving poor results. Now, leadership is a positive influence of a person or group. And I think that we all have this approach to influence people better. But again, when we look at wrong that produces wrong and good intentions that still produce wrong, when it comes to helping flawed people become productive and effective, if influencing people is not done correctly, then we're going to find ourselves very frustrated when it comes to trying to help other people become the best versions of themselves. Now, this piece that I'm going to show you is from Dr. Carl Jung, and if that name sounds familiar to you, it's because he was a Swedish psychiatrist. He died in 1962, I believe it was, and he gave us the terms introvert and extrovert. He recognized the natural tendencies that flow out of human behavior and human personality, and that is essentially what we're going to deal with on how we get people to become the best version of themselves. Now, the idea that he is going to deal with is that when it comes to influencing people, we can't just approach them with, here's what you're doing wrong. We have to not only deal with the problem, but we have to align that individual with a vision that promises a better future. So let me just show you this piece. We seldom get rid of evil merely by understanding its cause. And for all our insight, obstinate habits do not disappear until replaced by other habits. But habits are won only by exercise, and appropriate education is the sole means to this end. The individual must be drawn out of himself into other paths, which is the true meaning of education. And this can only be achieved by an educative will. No amount of confession and no amount of explaining can make the crooked plant grow straight. It must be trained upon the trellis of the norm by the gardener's art. Now, that is a brilliant piece, and when I ran across this, I read it just this week in my reading path, and I was just enthralled by this because this kind of aligns with some of the things that we teach here at ExecuSpect when we talk about the positive influence of a person or group. But here's what I would say. There's three very important points that I got out of this. And the first comes out of what he said here. Obstinate habits do not disappear until replaced by other habits. Now, we all know the word obstinate. It's a stubbornness. It's the stubborn behavior of an individual with no desire or will to do otherwise. And so what Dr. Jung is suggesting that there are people that are just steeped in a mannerism that they just won't come out of. And he is saying they can come out of it, but it's not going to disappear until other habits replace that. And here's what I would say to that. Here's how I would interpret what he just said. Never discuss the problem an individual has without a positive alternative. And I think that this is a natural part of our human nature where in many cases we fail. Oftentimes we come with the problem and not interested in being a part of the solution. It's too easy to complain about things that are out there and not easy enough to say, but here's what I think we should do about it. So when we talk about bringing somebody out of an obstinate habit and into more of a pliable and productive habit, that involves change. And as we know, change is hard. And there's two reasons why change is hard: comfort and fear of the unknown. And I want to talk about both of these. So imagine, though, walking up to somebody and just saying, hey, you're screwing up and you need to do better. Unfortunately, there are leaders out there. I don't know, maybe you've experienced it. I hope you've not done this, but there are leaders out there who will absolutely walk up to a subordinate, walk up to an employee and say, you're doing it wrong, do it better. You're not productive. You need to be more productive. Pick up the pace. There's so many things wrong with that kind of directive, with that kind of leadership. You're not telling them where they're screwing up. You're not telling them how to do better. You're just saying you're screwing up, do better. There's no directive, there's no support, there's no coaching, there's no guidance involved in that statement whatsoever. So let's talk about comfort and fear of the unknown. Comfort, going back to this idea of introversion, extroversion, this psychology that Dr. Carl Jung recognized. When people behave the way they behave, it is generally because that is what they think is right. And they think it's right. The reason why they think it's right is because it's how they feel. It's how they process information. It's how they process challenges. It's how they process other people. And so we as human beings, flowing out of our innate characteristics, we will behave in a manner that feels right to us. So if somebody is refusing to change, it's because they're being asked to go against something that they don't believe. They believe that their approach is right. And the other is fear of the unknown. And this is supported by point number one here, that they have a particular belief system, a philosophy that the way they're doing things is right. So even if somebody wanted to change, even if somebody says, hey, look, I know I'm not productive, but I just don't know any other way. That's the problem, because they have these personality blinders on. They have this comfort level that oftentimes they haven't explored another way because they are convinced that their way is the right way. There are leaders out there that are literally checking the boxes of leadership and saying, I feel like I'm doing everything right, but nothing is changing. And oftentimes they blame the workers. They blame other people because they themselves believe that everything they're doing is right. They're putting a check mark in every box of what they believe is right. And so what happens is they either revert to accusing or they revert to leading by fear, which is what I think the second point of Dr. Jung's writing is about. He says this: the individual must be drawn out of himself into other paths. Now, I find it interesting that he uses the word drawn. The individual must be drawn out of himself. That's a very compassionate word. It's not an aggressive word. It's not an instantaneous word. It is a word that suggests two things: time and willingness. So let's talk about those. First is time. Now, depending on the need of the individual, we cannot expect immediate change from people. And going back to that statement, you're screwing up and you got to do better, that is exactly what that's expecting. That's expecting immediate change. And if we can understand the psyche behind how people process frustrations and opportunities and challenges, then we can understand that getting that person to adopt a philosophy that goes against everything that they believe, every fiber of their existence, that does not happen immediately. Now, understand, this doesn't talk about, I don't think Dr. Jung is including people who are intentionally toxic and divisive and that are causing damage within the organization. That is an immediate change that has to happen. They need to be fired. But think about the speed at which you could turn a kayak versus a cargo ship. If one of your workers is a cargo ship, they're not problematic. but they're just not reaching their full potential and they're steeped in where they are. This is going to take time for that individual to change. And you have to be willing to invest that time, which draws us to our second point of the word drawn, time and willingness. Willingness. Now, willingness involves two people, you and the worker. You have to be willing, they have to be willing. But here's what I would tell you. They will never be willing until you are first willing. And what does this mean? What does it mean for you to be willing to change that person? It has nothing to do, once again, with demanding that they change. But it has everything to do with something that Paul said in the Bible in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. He says, I have become all things for all people that I might save some. That is a very powerful approach to the positive influence of a person or group. You see, Paul understood that people process things differently. And we understand because we see it on a daily basis within our organizations that people process problems and challenges and opportunities differently. There are things that make them fearful. There are things that inspire them. There are things that motivate them. There's things that excite them. And every leader must learn, every individual, in what turns them on, what turns them off, what gets them to begin to move. And when that leader can adjust his or her behavior, when that leader is willing to say, okay, I have a particular mannerism myself. And there are some leaders, you've probably heard it. They would approach leadership to say, I gotta keep it real. I gotta be me. You can take me or leave me. You can love me or hate me, but I gotta be authentic. I have to be true to myself. And they feel like adjusting their behavior to accommodate the need of a follower is not being true to themselves. And the reality is, being true to yourself is recognizing the situational leadership that is a reality of life. Let's face it, you as a human being, you've adjusted your behavior for other people. Maybe your spouse, you do a thing that she doesn't like and she's expressed that she didn't like it or he didn't like it. So you adjust that behavior. We do it all the time. Some people, some leaders just refuse to do it for their workers. So the worker is never going to be willing to be drawn out of their ineffectiveness and complacency unless the leader is first willing to adjust his or her behavior to cause that desire to begin to change. So leaders have to be willing to know their people on an intimate level. Because the reality is if followers feel rejected, then they will in turn reject the leader. But people follow those that they love. We have commercials on TV right now, dating commercials that say this. This is their marketing line. Get who gets you. Right? Get who gets you. When it comes to sales, people buy from the people they trust. People follow the people that they trust. When you trust someone, you follow them. We have to begin as leaders to draw them out of that complacency that begins with effective communication on their level so that trust can begin. Now, I have a third point here, but I have to include it with the statement from this point that we just discussed. And here's what it is. I'll remind you what this says. The individual must be drawn out of himself into other paths, which is the true meaning of education. And this can only be achieved by an educative will. This is a very powerful statement, which is the true meaning of education. And this can only be achieved by an educative will. Here's what I take from that. You cannot move the immovable. And I would go further and say the immovable will not move the immovable. If you have an immovable leader, that immovable leader will never move an immovable worker. We've already discussed how you need to be willing to adjust your behavior and adjust your leadership style so that you can begin that implanting in that worker the desire to begin to move. But here's what I would say. What Carl Jung is saying here, when he says this is the true meaning of education and this can only be achieved by an educative will, here's what he's suggesting. He is taking the pressure off of leaders who are emotionally struggling and they're stressing over bearing the burden of responsibility for workers who simply have rejected them. They will not change. There's an obstinance to them. There's a stubbornness, and they absolutely will not change. I like the fact that he used the word education, and not to insult your intelligence, but education involves two people, a teacher and a student. Teacher cannot teach without a student, and a student cannot learn without a teacher. You need both. Now, we've already talked about you as the teacher being willing to change and willing to move. But here's what I'm going to say to you. Dr. Carl Jung discusses the educative will, in which he refers to not just the teacher, you, but the student as well. And we've already discussed how you need to change, but the teacher has to be willing to adjust. But here's what I really think. I think it's interesting that he closes that whole thing out with the illustration of the gardener's trellis. The reason why I find that so interesting is because I'd read a book that was written in 1974, and the author said this: "It is the nature of everything alive to grow." Think about that statement. Very simple statement, very powerful. It is the nature of everything alive to grow. When we think about businesses that are thriving, they're growing. When we think about people that are improving, they're growing. It is the nature of everything alive to grow. If you're growing, you're living. A lack of growth is not stagnation. It's dying. I don't believe in stagnation. And here's what I would say to you. It is a natural part of human nature to want to improve. I think every person who is worth their own weight has a desire to say, I want to be a better father. I want to be a better husband. I want to be a better wife. I want to be a better mother, an aunt, an uncle. I want to be a better neighbor. I want to be a better worker. I want to be a better leader. Whatever it is, we all have a natural tendency to recognize that we are inherently flawed, but we have this pathway that we want to improve. And I find it fascinating that Dr. Jung uses the idea of a trellis and a plant. And you think about that trellis is there for a reason, because that plant is going to sprout out from the soil, and it's going to be weak, and it needs some strength, and it needs something that it can wrap around and just use as a guide as it continues to grow. That's you, leader. You are that gardener's trellis. You're not there to dictate. You're not there to... Now, there are certain things that have to be done in a certain way, but when it comes to the relational aspect of leader and follower, trellis and plant, that you are there to be a strong support, and that you have that relationship. You have that intimate relationship where the worker can lean on and trust and grab hold of that leader for strength and support for its own growth. And that's what the relationship of communication, that's how we begin to draw that person out of complacency or a flawed behavior to a more productive behavior, is be that solid trellis upon which that plant can depend. Now, I'm going to leave you with one final illustration because I think this is perfect that goes along with this. In the book of John, in the Bible, Jesus talks about the relationship between shepherd and sheep. And he says this. He said, the sheep will follow the shepherd because they know his voice. Now, that's a very powerful statement there, because the only reason why they know his voice is because of a familiarity, because of a relationship. They know his voice. They recognize his voice because of the proximity between the shepherd and the sheep. And here's a take that I had gotten from that. There are sheep. There may at times be sheep within that flock that do not follow the shepherd. And when I think about that, when I think about people within your organization, workers who are immovable, you're trying to change them. You've done everything you can. You've become the best gardener's trellis that you can possibly be. You are there. You're adjusting your behavior. You're willing to adjust in order for them to be the best version of themselves, but they absolutely will not move. I've known leaders to stress over this and take on the burden of responsibility for people that absolutely will not change. Leader, they're not your responsibility. They're not your employee. They never were. They never will be. These are people that, for whatever reason, they're just there to cause problems, I guess. I don't know what their motive is. But the reality is there are some people within organizations that are great workers, but they're immovable when it comes to their behavior. And this is a real challenge when it comes to leadership, is to get rid of the people who are not your responsibility. They're not a part of the team, even though they're as effective as they are. You cannot change the immovable. You cannot move the immovable. And when there are people within the organization that are immovable, when you have a weed growing up with a plant, that can become a very dangerous thing. So here's what I would suggest to you, leader. Understand your role. Be the best trellis that you can possibly be. Be for your workers who they need you to be. and build that relationship, and you will begin to see workers drawn out, connecting with you, depending on you, following you, and becoming a cohesive, loyal, committed team whereby you are creating an organization that is highly effective. I want to thank you for watching this today, and I hope you've gotten something out of this. If you have any questions about leadership or any products or services that we provide, I would encourage you to call 989-402-5029, or you can email us at info@execuspec.com. ExecuSpec Leadership Development, developing successful executives by improving leadership perspectives.